It's about to get interesting, so subscribe and hit like so you don't miss the top content. I never thought my life would turn as dramatically as it did that night. Amy and I lived in a small town in Oregon, in a house with a white picket fence and a view of the pine forest that stretched to the horizon. It was our little piece of the American dream. 2 stories, a 20-year mortgage, and a dog named Rocky who loved to chase squirrels in the yard. I was 35, she was 33, and I figured we'd been through everything we could: job loss, loan debt, even the death of her father a couple years ago. We held together as if glued by a shared past, and I was sure our history was something as secure as the concrete foundation under our house. That day began as usual. I got home from work. I'm an engineer at a local company that makes stuff for logging. Nothing outstanding but stable. Tired, with the smell of machine oil on my hands, I walked into the house, dropped my bag by the door, and heard Amy fiddling in the kitchen. She was cooking something with garlic and rosemary, and the smell filled the entire first floor. Rocky came lazily over to me, tail wagging, and I noticed that Amy had put a bottle of wine on the table, not the cheap stuff we usually got, but some expensive stuff, with a label I couldn't even pronounce. It was weird, but I wrote it off as her probably having a good day at her online handmade jewelry store. She always loved surprising me with little things like that. We sat down to dinner, and I started telling her about how one of the guys at work had dropped a bolt in the machine and we had to spend half an hour pulling it out. She was nodding, smiling, but something in her eyes wasn't right. They glittered, not from the light of the lamp above her desk, but from something else I couldn't understand. I shook off the feeling, poured myself some more wine, and asked her how her day had been. She was silent for a moment, staring at her plate of chicken, and then she looked up and said she wanted to talk about something important. My heart jumped, because at times like that you usually expect bad news: someone died, or she's sick, or, hell, we're having money problems again. But I was wrong. This was worse. She began to speak slowly, choosing her words as if she were treading on thin ice. It seems to her, she said, that we should try something new in our relationship. I frowned, not understanding where she was going with this. Maybe she wanted to move, or have a baby? We'd discussed it before, but always put it off. But then she exhaled and said it: open marriage. I froze with fork in hand, looking at her as if she was suddenly speaking another language. An open marriage? Does that mean we're going to sleep with other people? My brain tried to make sense of what I was hearing, but all I could feel was a growing buzz in my ears, like someone had turned on an old TV with static. I sat in silence while she explained. She said she felt stuck, that she loved me, but she needed more freedom, more experience. She was missing something she couldn't find in our lives. I looked at her and didn't recognize her. This was my Amy. The Amy I met at a bar in Portland 10 years ago when she spilled a beer on me and laughed while I wiped my shirt with a napkin. This was the same Amy I'd spent hundreds of evenings with on the couch rewatching old movies, and the one who'd cried on my shoulder when her father died. But now she was sitting across from me, offering to destroy everything I thought was our reality. I wasn't angry right away. At first, there was just bewilderment. I tried to figure out what drove her to do this. Maybe I'd missed something. Maybe I'd gotten too caught up in my work, too used to the routine. I started going over the last few months in my head. Were there any signs? She sometimes stayed late at her friend Lisa's house, but I never suspected anything wrong. She started sitting on her phone more often, but I thought it was because of her store. Now all these little things were adding up to some ominous picture, and I felt something inside me clench. Then she told me that she had already thought about it for a long time and even read articles and watched videos on the subject. She assured me that it wasn't cheating, it was just a new phase, that we could set rules and stay honest with each other. I listened and couldn't believe this was happening. My wife, my Amy, was sitting in front of me and suggesting that I share her with someone else. I put my fork on the table because my hands were starting to shake and asked if she had already had someone. She shook her head, but something in her voice made me question it. I didn't press. I didn't want to know the truth at that moment because I was afraid she'd crush me. Dinner ended in silence. I went into the living room, sat on the couch and stared at the dark TV screen. Rocky lay down next to me and put his head in my lap, like he sensed something was wrong. Amy stayed in the kitchen putting away the dishes, and I could hear the plates clinking quietly against each other. I tried to realize what had just happened. My wife had proposed an open marriage, and I didn't know how to live with that thought. But that was just the beginning. A couple weeks later, I found out that she hadn't just proposed, she had already taken it a step further, and that turned things around even more. After that dinner, I felt like I was in some weird dream that you can't wake up from. Amy and I lived in our house in Oregon. But things were different. I went to work, fixing machines, chatting with my coworkers about stuff like soccer or the weather. But it was like something inside me had broken. I couldn't look at her the way I used to. She was making breakfast, stroking Rocky behind the ears, asking how my day was going. But every word she said sounded like an echo from another life. I didn't know how to bring it up again because I was afraid of hearing something that would finally tear my world apart. But I couldn't just forget, either. It was like a splinter that dug in deeper every day. A week went by. Maybe two. Time became a blur. I started noticing little things I'd missed before. She took her phone into the bathroom more often, though she used to leave it on the table. Sometimes she came home later, citing a meeting with Lisa or some shopping errands. I didn't ask because I didn't want to seem paranoid, but suspicions grew like weeds in our neglected garden. I even started checking her Instagram, which I'd never done before, just flipping through the stories, trying to find anything that would give me a clue. Nothing obvious was there, just pics of her jewelry, Starbucks coffee, and a couple of shots of Rocky against the sunset, but I could feel something going on behind me. One evening I came home earlier than usual. One of the big machines at work had broken down, and the boss had let half the shift go while they fixed it. I walked into the house, threw my keys on the nightstand, and heard that Amy wasn't in the kitchen. Usually at this time she was already cooking something or sitting with her laptop working on her orders. Rocky met me at the door, but he didn't run after me, just lay down on the doorstep as if he didn't want to get involved. I went upstairs, and then it came to me that her voice was coming from our bedroom. She was speaking softly, almost a whisper, but I could make out bits of phrases. Yes, he'll be here tomorrow, and no, he doesn't know anything. My heart pounded so hard I thought it was going to jump out of my chest. I froze at the door, hesitant to go in, but then I pushed it open. She was sitting on the bed with her phone to her ear, and when she saw me, her face went pale. She quickly said, "I'll call you back," and hung up like a kid caught red-handed. I stood in the doorway looking at her and asked who she was talking to. She faltered, said it was Lisa, that they were discussing some joint project for the store, but I could see her eyes running. The way she was rubbing the edge of the blanket, she always did that when she was nervous or lying. I didn't argue, just nodded and went downstairs. At that moment, I realized I couldn't pretend like everything was normal anymore. The next day I did something I'd never done before. While she was in the shower, I took her phone. I knew the password, she hadn't changed it since we'd started dating. The day of our first date, I opened the messages and found a chat room with some guy named Jake. It was full of everything from "meet me at the coffee shop tomorrow" to "are you sure he's okay with it?" My throat constricted like someone had shoved a lump in there. I scrolled up above and saw that it had started a couple months ago. She'd texted him about how bored she was, how she wanted to spread her wings, and he'd responded with all kinds of wussy bullshit about how she deserved more. I almost threw my phone against the wall, but instead put it back down before she came out. That night I waited until she went to bed and went out to the garage, sat there with a can of beer and just stared at the old workbench I had once promised to fix. I felt like an idiot. She wasn't just proposing an open marriage, she was already living it without telling me. I thought back to all the times she'd gone to Lisa's, all the smiles I'd taken for love, and realized it was a lie. I didn't know what to do. Divorce? A fight? Just walk away? I had no answers, only emptiness inside and the feeling that my home, my life, my Amy, none of it was mine anymore. Then I decided to post here, on Reddit, because I needed to vent. I've been sitting in this garage for the third hour, writing this from my phone, with Rocky sleeping at my feet. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I feel like this is just the beginning of some kind of nightmare. If anyone has any advice on how to survive such a betrayal, I'd love to hear it, because right now I'm just lost. I sat in the garage until dawn, watching the light slowly creep in through the cloudy window with the pine trees behind me. The beer was long gone, and Rocky was sleeping quietly at my feet, as if he didn't care that my world was falling apart. I didn't go back to the house that night. I didn't want to see Amy lying in our bed, pretending nothing had changed. Instead, I sat there, spinning everything I'd learned from her correspondence with this Jake guy in my head. Each message was like a knife, but I couldn't stop mentally going over them again and again. She was texting him that I was a nice guy but too predictable, that she needed something more, and he, the bastard, would reply that he'd give her anything she wanted. I felt empty, like someone had ripped out a part of me I didn't even know existed. In the morning, I heard Amy coming downstairs. She was calling for me, probably surprised that I wasn't in the kitchen, drinking my usual coffee before work. I didn't answer. Instead, I grabbed Rocky's leash, took him outside, and went for a walk. I needed to clear my head, figure out what to do next. We wandered down the path along the woods, and I watched Rocky chase squirrels while I tried to collect myself. I decided I wasn't going to make a scene. Not right now. I wanted to find out how far she'd gotten before I laid all my cards on the table. Maybe it was cowardly, but I wasn't ready to hear the truth to her face, not after she'd lied so much. When I returned, Amy was already gone. There was a note on the table. Gone to Lisa's. I'll be back for dinner. I almost laughed with bitterness. To Lisa's. Of course, I knew she was going to him. To this Jake, and the thought made my insides twist. But I didn't call her or text her. Instead, I went to the bedroom, opened her closet, and started going through her things. I don't know what I was looking for: proof, evidence, something that would finally confirm what I already knew, and that's when I found this. Under a stack of her sweaters was a small box wrapped in a tattered cloth. I pulled it out, opened it, and froze. Inside was a pendant, a silver one, engraved with a J and the date, September 12th of last year. That was 3 months before she'd talked about an open marriage. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the thing in my hands, trying to figure out what it meant. She hadn't just been seeing him recently, it had been going on for a long time, much longer than I thought. And this pendant, this little secret she'd been hiding in her closet, was like proof that I was a blind fool. The date on it was the day she told me she was going to the craft fair with Lisa. I remembered her coming back late, smiling, smelling of vanilla and something else I didn't recognize at the time. I realized now that it had been more than just a successful day at the fair. I put the pendant back away, folded everything neatly as it was, and left the room. My mind was boiling. Not only was she cheating on me, but she was keeping it as some kind of trophy, a reminder of her second life. I didn't know what was worse, the fact that she was lying to my face, or the fact that she had the nerve to keep it right under my nose. I decided it was time to take action. I wasn't going to yell or cause a scandal, that wasn't my style. Instead, I started planning. I wanted to find out who this Jake was, where he lived, what he did. I wanted to put all the pieces of the puzzle together before she realized I knew. That night, when she came back, I pretended it was business as usual. We had dinner, and I even made a joke about Rocky chasing squirrels in his sleep again. She was smiling, chatting about some trivia, and I looked at her, knowing that she had just been with him. I felt like an actor in a bad movie, but I kept my cool. Later, I texted on Reddit again from my phone. Sitting in the living room while she showered, I told her about the pendant, how I'd found it, and asked for advice. Some said to leave, some said to talk, some said to gather evidence and file for divorce. I hadn't decided what I was going to choose yet, but one thing was certain: that little secret in the box had changed everything. Now I play by my own rules. After I found the pendant, I could no longer live in limbo. It was like a slowly smoldering wick that was about to get to. I decided it was time to end this game, but not in the way she probably expected. I didn't want screams, tears, or long explanations. I just needed to walk out of this nightmare with my chin up. I began to proceed quietly, methodically, like the engineer that I was. First, I gathered what I could without attracting her attention. Photographed correspondence with Jake on her phone while she slept. Took a picture of the pendant with the date and the letter J. I even found his address through one of her chat rooms. He lived in Portland, an hour away. Some artist who made sculptures out of scrap metal. Ironic that my life now looked like a pile of rubble. 2. I didn't talk to her right away. Instead, I went to see a lawyer. Found one in a neighboring town so no one I knew would recognize him. He was an old man with tired eyes, but he knew his business. I laid out everything I had: pictures, dates, even that damn note about Lisa. He said that in Oregon, divorce is no fault, so her cheating wouldn't play a big role in court, but the evidence would help if she suddenly decided to stall or demand more than she was owed. He and I made a plan. I file for divorce. Take Rocky and half of what we have. The house would have to be sold. But I didn't care. I didn't want to live in those walls of lies anymore. A couple days later, I took the final step. Amy had gone to Lisa's once again, and I packed up my things. Not much: clothes, tools from the garage, a couple of old books I loved. Rocky watched me while I loaded everything into the pickup, and I felt like he was wondering what was going on. I patted him on the head and promised him we'd find a new place where it would be just the two of us. Then I left her a letter on the kitchen table. Nothing long or dramatic, just wrote that I knew about Jake, found the pendant, and was filing for divorce. I added that a lawyer would contact her, and asked her not to call me. There was nothing more to talk about. I signed off with a short goodbye. I left the same evening. I rented a small apartment in another town, far away from our house, from the forest, from everything that reminded me of her. The job allowed for a transfer to another facility, so I started from scratch. It was hard at first. I'd wake up at night expecting to hear her footsteps or Rocky barking in response to her, but then I got used to it. Rocky became my anchor. We walked new trails, and I even started fixing up that old workbench I'd taken from the garage. It was kind of therapeutic, putting something together with my own hands when everything inside still lay in ruins. Amy tried to contact me a couple times through messages, but I didn't read them. The lawyer said she was angry at first, then tried to bargain, but finally signed the papers. The house sold 3 months later. The money was split in half, and I invested my part in a small piece of land outside of town. Nothing grand, just a place where I could build something of my own when I was ready. She probably stayed with Jake. I didn't care. I'd heard from mutual acquaintances that she tried to tell everyone like it was my fault for not wanting to experiment, but I didn't make excuses. Let them think what they want. Now I'm sitting on the porch of my rented apartment, drinking coffee and watching Rocky chase birds in the yard. It's been almost a year since that dinner when she proposed an open marriage, and I finally feel like I'm breathing freely. I'm not angry anymore, not at her, not at myself. It was like a storm that passed and left behind clear skies. I wrote this on Reddit to draw a line under the whole story. Thank you to those who advised me in the comments. You helped me not to break down. I now know for sure, I did it. It's over, and I'm ready to move on with my life.